heard my daughter's voice before I saw her face, a sharp whisper slicing through the kitchen doorway. "Mom, you're just too old for the life I'm building now." I remember my hands trembling around a chipped mug, the faint scent of Earl Grey floating up as if to steady me. But it didn't. Nothing did in that moment. Her words clung to the air like smoke, refusing to drift away. "I'm Evelyn, though most people still call me Evie. I'm 67 years old, with silver hair that curls whether I ask it to or not, and a heart that has survived more winters than I care to count. I lost my husband, Daniel, 10 years ago, a quiet man who loved crossword puzzles, and left me a folder of meticulously labeled financial documents as his final act of devotion. After he passed, I poured myself into helping our daughter Caroline. I watched her boys after school, paid their dental bills when her insurance lapsed, and even co-signed the lease on her new townhouse because her credit was temporarily messy, as she put it. I didn't mind. Love, after all, asks us to stretch. But stretches can become contortions when no one notices the pain. That morning, Caroline walked around the kitchen tapping on her phone, her tone light, almost rehearsed. She had just gotten a promotion at the boutique marketing firm downtown, and her new boyfriend, some tech guy named Luke with a fondness for self-help podcasts, was helping her reshape her future. I suppose I became part of the excess weight she needed to shed. She said my presence made her house feel cluttered, that I worried too much, that the boys needed a nanny who was more aligned with their schedule. I just stared at the steam lifting from my tea, wondering how grief could sit silently for years and then roar back to life in a single sentence. For a moment, I wanted to ask her if she remembered the nights I sat up with her during high school heartbreaks, or the morning I drove 3 hours to bring her the birth certificate she forgot before a job interview. But she was already talking about drop-off procedures and how the Townhouse Association required updated parking permits. I realized then that I had become invisible in my own life. The weeks that followed blurred into routines that weren't mine. Caroline gave me new boundaries, a printed schedule she typed up, with fonts and color coding, outlining when I could visit the boys. My name sat at the bottom of the page like a footnote. She asked me to sign it, just so we're all on the same page. I did, though something inside me cracked like old varnish. Bills came and went. My modest pension barely covered property taxes. But I made do as I always had. Caroline forgot to reimburse me for groceries and school supplies I picked up, even though she'd promised she would. I kept my receipts, slipping them into Daniel's old filing cabinet, unsure why. Maybe it was habit. Maybe it was hope. One afternoon, while picking up the boys from soccer practice, the coach pulled me aside. He gently mentioned he needed the updated authorization form since I wasn't technically listed as a guardian anymore. The ink of Caroline's signature on the new paperwork was still fresh. I drove home with the boys chattering in the back seat, my heart sinking a little deeper with each mile. Still, I kept quiet. That's what mothers do, isn't it? We shoulder what others drop. We balance households with invisible labor, making sure no one ever sees us strain. But one evening, after Caroline sent me a message saying she wanted her keys back, just to keep things simple, I sat alone at my kitchen table with the worn wood grain glowing under the lamp. I felt something shift inside me. It wasn't anger. It wasn't revenge. It was clarity. She had built a life with no space for me. And for the first time, I looked around and wondered why I had never built one of my own. The realization was soft at first, like the rustle of paper when you open a new envelope. But it grew louder, steadier, until it felt like a voice I'd been ignoring for years finally spoke up. I looked at the neat stack of receipts I'd kept, the lease agreement I'd co-signed, the texts where she asked for just one more little favor. I didn't know exactly what I wanted yet, but I knew this time my choices would not be shaped by guilt or obligation. For the first time in a long while, I felt the faintest spark of something warm, something like courage, flicker inside my chest. I placed my hand over it, as if afraid it might slip away. But it didn't. It stayed. The next morning, sunlight crept through the blinds in thin, reluctant lines, as if even the day itself wasn't sure it wanted to begin. I sat at my tiny kitchen table with a bowl of oatmeal, the kind that turns gummy if you hesitate too long. I stirred it absent-mindedly while replaying Caroline's message from the night before. "It's better if you don't have a key anymore, Mom." Boundaries. That final word echoed with a firmness I had never used on her, not once in 38 years of motherhood. I suppose every parent carries small, quiet humiliations they never speak of. Mine surfaced now in slow waves, the time she asked me to wait outside her bridal shop appointment because the aesthetic didn't match the vibe she wanted. The Christmas when she gave me a scented candle and a mug while I had spent half my pension on gifts for her boys. The way Luke looked at me like I was a misplaced antique, valuable only in sentiment, not in use. My hands trembled slightly as I reached for Daniel's old file cabinet. The metal handle was cold, familiar. Inside were the documents he left behind: insurance policies, our marriage certificate, account ledgers written in his neat, looping handwriting. All those years, he tried to teach me how to handle things on my own, and I'd brushed him off with a smile. "I'll learn someday," I'd say. I didn't realize someday would arrive after he was gone. Behind his folders lay the newer stack I'd added over the past few years: receipts for groceries, sports fees, school supplies, a printed copy of the townhouse lease I had co-signed, even a text transcript I once exported because Caroline insisted I'd misheard her about repayment. I never meant to collect evidence. I think I just needed proof that I wasn't imagining things. A soft knock pulled me out of my thoughts. It was my neighbor, Mrs. Whitman, a retired librarian with reading glasses that always hung from a beaded chain. She held a misdelivered envelope, one of Caroline's apparently, and smiled warmly. "You look pale, Evie. Everything all right?" I opened my mouth, then closed it again. Something inside me resisted pouring out the truth. I didn't want pity. I wanted understanding, maybe even dignity. So I told her I was fine, thanked her for the envelope, and watched her shuffle down the walkway with her cardigan swaying like a curtain. Inside the envelope was a bank notice, Caroline's name printed boldly. My eyes drifted to a line near the bottom: co-signer, Evelyn Whitmore. It was a renewal notice for the townhouse parking permit fee, past due. They were charging a late penalty, and because my name was attached, they were sending me the notification. A strange calm settled over me as I read it twice, then a third time. It was as if life was quietly revealing something it had been trying to show me for years. Not cruelty, but carelessness. I had been living on the edge of someone else's decisions without ever being invited into the room where those decisions were made. That afternoon, I drove to the bank. The building had that sterile scent of printer ink and carpet cleaner, and the faint hum of the air conditioner filled the space between footsteps. A young banker named Paul greeted me with a practiced smile. He couldn't have been more than 25. When I explained why I was there, his expression softened into something almost apologetic. "Ma'am, your daughter would need to remove you as co-signer, but you do have the right to request a full account disclosure related to your liability." I nodded, feeling a small tremor of empowerment. I signed the request form carefully, forming each letter with deliberate grace. My handwriting has always been tidy, something Daniel used to tease me about. Walking back to my car, I felt lighter, though nothing in my life had actually changed yet. Maybe it was the simple act of taking a step, not for Caroline, not for the boys, but for myself. When I got home, I brewed a fresh pot of tea and opened my notebook, the one with pressed violets on the cover. I began jotting down dates, expenses, and memories, not to accuse, not yet, but to understand the shape of the life I had been quietly carrying. For the first time in years, I heard my own voice in my head louder than Caroline's, louder than the past, louder than the loneliness. It said something simple, something steady. You matter. I closed the notebook gently as if sealing a promise. Outside, the sun slipped behind the rooftops, leaving the sky a soft lavender. I sat in that fading light with a stillness I hadn't felt in ages, unaware that small choices can be the first threads of a new life, and mine had just begun to weave itself. I didn't expect the breaking point to arrive on an ordinary Thursday, wrapped in the quiet rustle of envelopes and the hum of my old refrigerator. But that's how life works, isn't it? The moments that change everything rarely knock. They slip in through the cracks when you're not looking. That morning, I received a voicemail from Caroline. Her tone was clipped, businesslike, the way she speaks to interns she doesn't plan to keep. "Mom, I need you to cover the boys tomorrow. Luke and I are doing a weekend retreat. It's important, and please don't make this complicated." No greeting, no warmth, no acknowledgement that she had taken my house key just days before. I stood there in my kitchen listening to it twice, maybe 3 times, until the words blurred into something heavy and sour. She didn't ask if I was free. She didn't ask if I had plans. She just assumed, as she always had, that I would bend to fit whatever shape she needed. I tried calling her back, but she didn't answer. She texted instead. "Just handle it. You're good at that." A strange ache settled in my chest. Good at that. Not good as a mother or a grandmother or a woman with a life of her own, just good at handling things she didn't want to deal with. I placed my phone on the counter and stared at its faint glow, wondering how long I had been disappearing without noticing. And then something unexpected happened. I cried. Not the soft, restrained tears that fall politely. No, this was the deep, shaking grief that rises from the bones. Years of being overlooked, underappreciated, quietly dismissed. I let it come. I let it wash through me like a storm that had been waiting decades for its chance. When it finally eased, I felt strangely hollow. But in that hollow space, a new thought formed. Quiet, but unmistakably clear. I don't have to live like this. It startled me, not because it felt rebellious, but because it felt true. I had given so much of myself away that I'd forgotten I had any say left in my own life. I sat down at the table and forced myself to breathe deeply. My hands shook as I opened my notebook. I wasn't sure what I meant to write, but the pen moved anyway, tracing the simple truth. I deserve better. Have you ever felt something like this? That moment when the world tilts just enough for you to see your life from a higher vantage point, as if you've stepped outside yourself and finally recognized the exhaustion you've been carrying. As I sat there, a memory surfaced, a soft one from years ago. Daniel and I sitting in the backyard, him sipping lemonade while telling me that clarity doesn't come in lightning strikes, but in gentle shifts, like the tide pulling you somewhere new. I felt that tide now. My phone buzzed. Another message from Caroline. "I also need you to pay for their lunch accounts. The school app is being weird. I'll pay you back." She had said that before. She never did. I looked at the message. Then I looked at my stack of receipts, my signed agreements, my documented text history, the late fees she didn't notice or didn't care to mention. For the first time, I didn't feel guilty for noticing the imbalance. I felt purposeful. I opened her message but didn't reply. My silence felt like a small revolution. Later that afternoon, I went for a walk. The air smelled of freshly cut grass, and children rode their bikes down the sidewalk, shouting things only children can get away with. Mrs. Whitman waved from her porch. I waved back. The ordinary world carried on, unaware that something inside me was rearranging itself. By the time I returned home, the soft spark I'd felt days before had grown steadier. Not a flame yet, but warmth, direction. I knew I wasn't ready to confront Caroline. Not directly. My heart still trembled too easily. But I could prepare. I could learn. I could gather the strength that had been hiding beneath years of gentleness. For the first time in a long time, I made myself a proper dinner. Grilled chicken, steamed vegetables. Nothing fancy, but cooked for me. I set the table with one plate and lit the small candle Daniel and I once saved for nice evenings. It flickered softly, as if remembering those days too. Over dinner, I whispered something aloud, just to hear it in the air. My life isn't over. The words surprised me. They sounded braver than I felt. But sometimes, speaking a truth is the first step toward living it. That night, before I went to bed, I placed my notebook on the nightstand. The page with "I deserve better" remained open, catching the lamp's warm glow. And for the first time in years, I slept without the weight of someone else's expectations pressing against my dreams. The next day began with the soft scrape of my mailbox opening. I hadn't expected anything important, maybe a coupon booklet or another medical reminder. But instead I found a slim white envelope with my name printed neatly across the front. No return address. Inside was a notice from the leasing office of Caroline's townhouse community. A friendly reminder, they called it, though there was nothing friendly about realizing my signature still tethered me to her financial decisions. The letter listed outstanding maintenance charges she had ignored. Small ones, perhaps, but added together, they made a number that tightened my breath. I held the paper between my fingers, feeling its weight. These were fees she'd promised to handle. Promises whispered quickly while tapping on her phone. Promises dismissed just as quickly when she needed something else from me. I set the letter on the kitchen table beside the others, forming a quiet row of truths I could no longer sweep aside. The morning light slanted across them, illuminating what I had tried not to see. A history of assumptions, of burdens handed to me as if I were an extension of her life, not a person with one of my own. Outside, a delivery truck rumbled down the street. A dog barked. Ordinary sounds, yet they felt sharper today, as if the world had turned its volume up just enough to remind me I was still here, still present, still capable of choosing something different. I decided to visit the leasing office myself, not to confront Caroline. No, I wasn't ready for that, but to understand exactly where I stood. Knowledge, after all, is its own kind of protection. The office was a modest building with bright blue trim and the faint scent of lemon cleaner. A young woman named Michelle greeted me with a polite but distracted smile. Her desk was cluttered with color-coded binders and a small succulent that seemed to be losing the will to live. "How can I help you today, ma'am?" she asked. I explained that I was listed as co-signer on my daughter's lease and had received a notice. Michelle typed quickly, her acrylic nails clicking like distant rain. After a moment, she turned the screen slightly toward me. "There are a few unpaid charges," she said gently. "Nothing alarming yet, but since your name is on the file, you do have the right to request the full account ledger." She printed the ledger and slid it across the desk. There they were, charges spanning months, repairs, late fees, parking adjustments. All of them quietly accumulating under a name that wasn't mine, yet legally still bound to me. So I ran my fingertips down the list, feeling both foolish and strangely empowered. Foolish for letting it go on so long, empowered because now I finally knew. Michelle looked at me with a softness I didn't expect. "If you need help removing yourself, There are procedures. It's not immediate, but it is possible. Her voice was so calm, so factual, that something loosened in me. This wasn't a moral failing. It wasn't cruelty. It was paperwork, policies, choices, and choices could be changed. I thanked her and left, the crisp ledger folded neatly in my purse. Outside, the sun had risen higher, warming the crown of my hair. I walked slowly to my car, listening to the crunch of gravel under my shoes. It felt grounding, like the earth reminding me I had a right to stand firm. At home, I spread the documents across my kitchen table, forming a map of a life I had unintentionally subsidized. Not out of generosity, though there had been plenty of that, but out of fear. Fear of being alone. Fear of losing the fragile threads that kept me connected to my daughter. Fear that if I set boundaries, she would walk away completely. But she had already been walking away for years, only I'd been too busy filling in the spaces she left behind to notice. My phone vibrated. A text from Caroline. "Mom, did you get the boys' lunch accounts topped up? I'm swamped today." I stared at the message, my thumb hovering over the screen. The familiar tug of obligation rose in me, the automatic instinct to fix, to soften, to smooth things over. But beneath it was something steadier, stronger, a voice that whispered, "Wait, just wait." I set the phone down without replying. Instead, I made myself a cup of coffee. I stood at the counter, watching the steam curl upward, smelling the rich bitterness that somehow always calmed me. As I sipped, I studied the documents again, not with dread this time, but with clarity. I wasn't preparing for a fight. I was preparing for a future, one where my life belonged to me again, one where I didn't measure my worth by how much I could carry for others, one where I was no longer invisible, even to myself. The sun shifted through the kitchen window, warming my hands. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel small or fragile or defeated. I felt ready. I didn't know exactly what I would do next, but I knew this much. I would no longer move through life by default. And somehow, that knowledge alone steadied my breath. I spent the next few days living in a kind of quiet observation, as if I were watching my own life from just outside the frame. Everywhere I looked, small truths revealed themselves. Subtle, ordinary, impossible to ignore once you finally learned how to see them. One morning, I found myself sorting through a stack of old utility bills. Some were mine, of course, but others, water charges from Caroline's townhouse, an electric bill from last winter, had somehow ended up mixed into my payments. She must have sent them over just until her autopay kicked in. It never did. I had paid them without thinking, without keeping track, without questioning why a 67-year-old widow was subsidizing a grown woman with a higher salary than I'd ever earned. I laid them in a neat line across the table, my breath steady, my hands no longer shaking. The pattern was undeniable now. Not malicious, perhaps, but careless, deeply, repeatedly careless. In the afternoons, I took slow walks around my quiet neighborhood. The maple trees had begun dropping their red and gold leaves, carpeting the sidewalks in colors that reminded me of childhood autumns, back when my mother would bundle me in scarves and send me out to play until my cheeks stung with cold. I remembered how safe I felt then, how anchored. I wondered when exactly I had stopped offering that safety to myself. One evening, as I was making soup, my mother's potato and leek recipe, the one Daniel always loved, my phone buzzed again. This time it was a voice message from Caroline. Her tone was rushed, but with that familiar edge of expectation. "Mom, I talked to Luke, and we really think it's important for you to step back more. The kids are getting used to their new routine, and it's confusing when you're around so much. I know you understand. Also, the school emailed me about an unpaid activity fee. If you could just take care of that, I'll sort it out later. I stood over the simmering pot, watching a bubble rise and break. Her words didn't wound me the way they once had. They no longer held the power to collapse my whole day. Instead, they floated through my mind like echoes from a life I was slowly walking away from. I stirred the soup and let the message end without replaying it. Something inside me had shifted so subtly over these days that I almost missed it. Her requests, her assumptions, her inability to see me as anything but a resource. None of it surprised me now, but it no longer defined me either. After dinner, I sat at my kitchen table with the documents spread out in quiet symmetry. The leasing ledger, the receipts, the overdue notices, the screenshots I had taken of messages she later denied sending. It was almost astonishing how much of my life fit neatly into manila folders. I wasn't angry as I looked at them. Not anymore. Anger is loud, chaotic, consuming. What I felt was something quieter, deeper. A kind of calm resolve, like the ocean at night, still on the surface but full of depth you cannot ignore. I realized then that waiting was no longer enough. Understanding was no longer enough. Seeing the truth was no longer enough. Something needed to happen. Not revenge, not retaliation, but change. My life had been shrinking for years, shaped around the needs of people who barely noticed the walls closing in around me. Now, for the first time, I was ready to open a door, to step into something unknown, maybe even frightening, but undeniably mine. Later that night, I pulled out Daniel's old laptop. It took a while to wake, humming faintly as if stretching its tired joints. I opened my files, insurance documents, pension papers, homeowner forms, and familiarized myself with every detail. Daniel had always insisted knowledge was a form of love. I never understood that until now. I bookmarked tenant rights pages. I read about co-signer liability. I watched a few seminars from elder resource centers, calm voices explaining autonomy, legal protections, financial boundaries. None of it felt dramatic or bold. It felt practical, sensible, almost soothing. By midnight, I had begun drafting a letter. Just a rough outline, typed slowly with pauses between sentences as I weighed each word like a stone in my hand. I wasn't ready to send it yet, but I would be, soon. Before I turned off the lights, I glanced once more at the neat rows of documents on my table. They weren't weights anymore. They were tools. I gently touched the corner of the ledger, as if acknowledging the quiet truth it carried. Something inside me whispered, not fierce, not triumphant, just assured. You are not trapped. You are preparing. And that preparation gave me a kind of peace I hadn't felt in years, the soft beginning of a life that no longer asked me to disappear. The next morning arrived with a pale, pearl gray sky, the kind that makes the world feel softer, quieter, as if it's holding its breath. I woke earlier than usual, not from worry, though that had been my alarm clock for years, but from a kind of alertness I couldn't name, as if the air itself had shifted and my body simply followed. I brewed a pot of coffee and sat at the table where all my documents still lay neatly arranged. They didn't intimidate me anymore. They felt like companions now, patient and honest. Pieces of a truth I had ignored, but was finally strong enough to face. While I sipped, my phone buzzed. Another message from Caroline. Mom, can you drop off the boys' jackets today? They forgot them in your car, and please don't stay long. We're trying to keep things consistent. I read the message twice. There was no malice in it, not really, just assumption, expectation, a daughter who had never looked beyond what I could provide. I typed back slowly. I'll leave them at the front desk. No explanation, no apology, no unnecessary warmth. When I hit send, my heart fluttered, not with guilt, but with a strange, tender pride. Such a small boundary, yet it felt like placing one stone at the edge of a long-neglected path. On my way to the townhouse community later that morning, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. The world looked spacious. Even the narrow streets bordered by parked cars and trimmed hedges felt open, as if I finally had room to breathe. At the front desk, the receptionist, a young man with tired eyes, smiled politely when I dropped off the jackets. "I'll make sure they get these," he said. I nodded and turned to leave, but a soft voice behind me called, "Mrs. Whitmore?" I turned back. It was the property manager, a poised woman named Denise, whom I had met once during Caroline's lease signing. She held a folder in her hands. "We received your request for the co-signer documentation," she said. "I thought I'd give you this personally. It has the official procedures if you intend to remove yourself from financial liability." Her tone was warm, respectful, not rushed, not dismissive. It startled me how unfamiliar that felt. Standing there with the folder in my hands, I felt the weight of years lift. Just a fraction, but enough to notice. "Thank you," I murmured, and my voice sounded steadier than I expected. Driving home, I passed the small park where I used to bring the boys. I remembered pushing them on swings, listening to their laughter rise like birdsong. Those memories didn't hurt. They glowed softly, reminding me of the love that had always been real, even if the appreciation had faded with time. Back home, I spread the new folder on the kitchen table. The paperwork was detailed but clear. Steps, signatures, timelines, all things I could follow. All things that afforded me a way out of the quiet shadow I had been living in. As I read, something inside me broke open. Not painfully, but honestly. A realization that felt like a truth I should have known long ago. I had allowed myself to become small in a life I helped build. And now, with every document I read, with every boundary I set, I felt myself expanding again. Slowly, carefully, but unmistakably. A soft tremor ran through me. Not fear, but unexpected emotion. So I closed the folder, rested my hands on it, and let the feeling come. Have you ever realized too late that you were being used? That the people you loved most had grown accustomed to your sacrifices, the way one becomes accustomed to the electricity, only noticing it when it fails? It's a sharp kind of clarity, but it's also cleansing. Later in the afternoon, while I was organizing Daniel's old desk drawers, I found a note tucked beneath a stack of envelopes. His handwriting, strong, looping, unmistakably his. "If you're reading this without me, Evie, trust yourself. You've always had more strength than you know." My breath caught. For a moment, I sat perfectly still, letting the warmth of his words move through me like sunlight through open curtains. I pressed the note to my chest, whispering, "I'm trying, Daniel. I really am." As the day faded, the house grew quiet, but it wasn't the hollow kind of quiet I'd grown used to. It was peaceful, intentional, a quiet that belonged to someone slowly reclaiming her life. I returned to the kitchen, gathered the documents into a single organized stack, and placed them into a new binder, one I bought just for this, just for myself. My hands felt steady as I slid the binder onto the counter. Not because everything was resolved, but because, for the first time in a very long time, I knew exactly where I stood and where I was determined to go. The first snow of the season arrived before dawn, dusting the neighborhood in a thin, delicate layer of white. When I stepped outside to fetch the morning paper, the cold air wrapped around me like a quiet reminder that seasons can change without asking anyone's permission. I stood there for a moment, watching the soft flakes drift down onto my coat sleeves. Something about the stillness felt symbolic, as if the world was pausing just long enough for me to catch up with myself. Inside, I made tea and opened the binder I had created. My binder, my gathering of truth. Each document was neatly placed in protective sleeves now, ordered by date, And for the first time, the chaos of my past few years looked manageable, almost elegant. I touched the edge of the first page, feeling a small swell of pride. Organization had once been an act of survival. Now it was becoming an act of empowerment. By noon, I decided to visit the school office. Not because I wanted to, but because something in Caroline's last message kept tugging at me. The unpaid activity fee she'd pushed my way. I knew I was done being the default solution, yet I needed to understand what exactly had been happening behind my back. The school building was warm, humming with the low chatter of students changing classes. The front office smelled faintly of pencil shavings and old carpet, familiar, nostalgic, in a strange way. A secretary with a floral scarf looked up at me kindly. "Mrs. Whitmore, right? You pick up your grandsons sometimes?" I nodded. I was hoping to check on their activity account. I've received some conflicting information. She tapped her keyboard, her bracelets jangling softly. After a moment, her expression shifted into something almost embarrassed. "It appears the account has been covered by you several times this year. We actually sent notices to both guardians on file. You're still listed as one." There it was again, that quiet, insidious assumption that I would manage whatever slipped through the cracks. "Could you print the payment history for me?" I asked gently. She nodded, and within minutes I had a detailed list in my hands. Dates, amounts, notes logged by office staff. A small world of responsibilities I had quietly absorbed without ever agreeing to them. Walking back to my car, the wind stung my cheeks, but I felt more awake than I had in years. That evening, I sat with the new printouts spread across my table. The pattern was unmistakable now, more visible than ever. Whenever Caroline didn't want to deal with something, it somehow became mine. Bills, fees, emotional labor, even decisions that should have never involved me. A part of me still mourned the daughter I thought I had, a woman who once clung to my arm on her first day of college, terrified of being on her own. A woman who called me for recipes, for comfort, for advice. A woman who used to say, "Mom, I don't know what I'd do without you." Now she said things like, "Don't stay long and you're confusing the boys and we're setting boundaries. Boundaries that only applied one way." But grief isn't always sorrowful. Sometimes it's clarifying, like wind sweeping dust off a window. When the dust settles, what you see is simple and real. I no longer felt resentment toward Caroline. I felt understanding, painful, yes, but clean. She wasn't intentionally cruel. She was simply used to a version of me that no longer existed. After dinner, the phone rang. Caroline's name appeared on the screen. I let it ring twice before answering. "Mom," she said in that brisk, managerial tone. "You didn't top up the boys' lunch accounts. They were short today." "I know," I replied calmly. The silence that followed was sharp. "You know?" "Yes." Another pause. Confusion tangled with irritation. I could almost see her blinking fast, trying to recalibrate. "Well, can you take care of it tonight? I'm exhausted." "No," I said, my voice gentle but unwavering. "Not anymore." Her inhale was audible. "Mom, what's gotten into you?" There it was, the question she should have asked years ago before assuming I would always be the steady hand behind her life. "I'm taking responsibility for my own life," I said, "and that means letting you take responsibility for yours." "Is this because I asked for my key back?" she snapped. "Or because of the schedule? You're overreacting." I kept my tone soft, almost tender. "I'm finally reacting, Caroline. That's all." She didn't know what to say. I didn't fill the silence for her. "I'll send you the login info," she muttered at last. "You can see the accounts yourself." "I already have the account history," I said quietly. Her breath hitched, a small, involuntary sound of surprise, maybe even fear. I didn't elaborate. She ended the call soon after, confused and unsettled, not yet aware of the quiet boundaries forming around me, like new walls. After I hung up, I sat alone in the soft glow of my kitchen lamp. The snow outside had deepened into a quiet blanket, covering the world in fresh, untouched white. A new beginning, a blank page. And for the first time, I didn't feel overwhelmed by it. I felt ready to write something entirely my own. The next few days unfolded with a strange, serene clarity, as if someone had finally cleaned the fogged edges of my life. I moved through my routines with a quiet steadiness. Laundry, morning tea, reading the newspaper. Each task grounding me in a way I hadn't felt in years. I wasn't waiting for Caroline's messages anymore. I wasn't hoping for softness that never came. I was simply living. One morning, while sorting through my mail, I found a brochure tucked between the bills. It was from the local community center, advertising art classes, book clubs, senior travel groups, yoga for beginners. I nearly put it aside out of habit. For so long, anything for me felt indulgent, irresponsible. irresponsible. But something made me pause. There was a watercolor class on Wednesday evenings. My mother had painted when I was young, filling our small home with the scent of turpentine and lilac hand cream. I had always wanted to try, but life, as it often does, had other plans. I traced the brochure with my thumb and whispered, "Why not?" That evening, I drove to the community center. The parking lot was full, lit with warm amber lights that glowed against the winter dusk. Inside, the air buzzed with soft conversation and the clatter of folding chairs. I followed the signs until I reached a room with large windows and tables covered in paint jars, brushes, and clean white paper that seemed to invite possibility. A woman about my age, with a halo of gray curls and paint smudges on her sleeves, greeted me. "First time?" she asked, her smile bright and unguarded. "Yes," I admitted, "in more ways than one." She laughed softly and guided me to a seat beside an elderly man in suspenders. The room smelled faintly of wet paper and eucalyptus soap. I felt nervous, almost foolish, holding a brush again after all these years of holding everything else together. But when I touched the bristles to the paper, a surprisingly steady stroke emerged. Color bloomed. Something inside me loosened, gently, almost imperceptibly, like a knot beginning to undo itself. Halfway through the class, the instructor dimmed the lights to show us blending techniques. The windows reflected our faces, older, lined, but full of stories and stubborn hope. I looked at my reflection and felt something warm rise in my chest. I was still here. After class, I stayed behind to clean my brushes. The man in suspenders approached me, holding a lopsided painting of a sunset. "You know," he said with a shy grin, "it doesn't look like much, but it feels good to start something new at our age." I smiled back, touched by his honesty. "Yes," I said softly, "it really does." Driving home, I noticed how the streetlights formed long golden pathways across the pavement. For once, I didn't feel like an outsider peering through the windows of my own life. I felt like a participant, but life, as always, has its way of testing new foundations. The next morning, I woke to a barrage of messages from Caroline. "Mom?" The leasing office emailed me. "Why are you asking for procedures about removing yourself as co-signer? What exactly are you planning?" Then another, "And why did the school say you requested the boys' account history? I don't understand what you're doing." Followed by, "Mom, call me. We need to talk now." I sat on the edge of my bed, phone in hand, feeling neither fear nor urgency, only a calm certainty that the path I was on was no longer up for negotiation. I didn't call her back. Instead, I brewed tea and opened the curtains. Snowflakes drifted slowly past the window, turning the world soft and white. I watched them fall, feeling an odd mix of peace and resolve. Around noon, the doorbell rang. I expected a delivery. Instead, I found Luke standing on my porch, hands shoved into the pockets of his expensive coat. His expression was tight, rehearsed, like someone preparing for a conversation he believed he could control. "Mrs. Whitmore," he began, attempting a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Caroline is upset. She thinks maybe you're misunderstanding the situation." I stepped aside but didn't invite him in. "I understand just fine, Luke," I said quietly. He blinked, thrown off by my calm. "Well, she's worried. She feels attacked." "Setting boundaries isn't an attack." His jaw shifted. "Caroline says you're threatening her stability. You know how much responsibility she has." Ah, there it was again, the unspoken rule that her responsibilities eclipsed mine, that her needs came first, that her life mattered more. I looked at him steadily, noticing how uneasy he grew under the softness of my gaze. "I'm not doing anything to destabilize her life," I said. "I'm simply allowing mine to have structure again." He opened his mouth, then closed it. Confusion flickered across his face. He wasn't used to me speaking this plainly. "You can tell Caroline," I added gently, "that I'm not angry. I'm not seeking conflict. But I won't continue living as a convenient backup plan." Luke exhaled slowly. "She won't like this." "I know," I said with a small, tired smile. "But she'll learn." There was nothing more to say, and Luke seemed to sense it. He nodded stiffly and walked back to his car, sliding inside with the awkwardness of a man who had stepped into a conversation far deeper than he anticipated. When his car finally disappeared down the road, I closed the door and leaned against it, feeling a quiet, profound certainty settle into my bones. My life was no longer defined by Caroline's needs. It was becoming something new, something mine, and I was no longer afraid of the space that truth created. The day after Luke's unexpected visit, I woke with an odd steadiness in my chest, an inner alignment I hadn't felt since before Daniel passed. Outside, the snow was melting in thin, glassy sheets along the sidewalk, and the world looked washed clean, as if preparing itself for something new. I brewed my coffee slowly, letting the warmth fill my palms while the house remained still around me. It was in that quiet that I realized something. I no longer felt the familiar anxiety of waiting for Caroline's reaction. For years, my mornings began with her needs. Texts, reminders, small emergencies that were never truly emergencies. But that morning, my thoughts weren't pulled toward her. They stayed with me. That felt like progress. Later, while sorting through more old papers, I found a letter Daniel had written during his last year. It was tucked inside a folder marked Household Notes, something I'd ignored countless times while searching for tax forms and insurance claims. The letter was short, a single page with his practical handwriting that always slanted slightly to the right. "Evie, if life ever becomes too heavy, remember that you are allowed to put things down. You are allowed to choose peace. Don't carry what isn't yours." I pressed the letter to my chest, feeling the weight of those words ripple through the years and land exactly where I needed them. For a long moment, I simply stood there, breathing deeply as a warmth spread through me. Not sorrow, not nostalgia, but something steadier. Permission. That afternoon, I called an attorney. His name was Thomas Harrington, a middle-aged man with a calm voice and an office only 3 blocks from my home. When I explained my situation, he asked if I could come in that same day. I hesitated, old habits telling me I should check with Caroline, ensure the timing didn't interfere with picking up the boys or handling some imagined crisis. Then I remembered the space I was claiming for myself and agreed without hesitation. Walking into his office felt strangely ceremonial. The walls were lined with framed certificates, and the faint scent of polished wood hung in the air, strong, reassuring. Thomas greeted me with a firm handshake and an attentive gaze. He didn't rush me. He didn't interrupt. He simply listened as I unfolded years of quiet burdens, financial responsibilities I never chose, agreements I signed out of love, boundaries that had dissolved long before anyone bothered to name them. When I finished, he nodded slowly. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, "you've carried far more than you should have, but the good news is that everything you've documented will make this process straightforward, painfully straightforward, actually." He flipped through the binder I brought, the ledger printouts, the lease agreement, the receipts, the school records. Each page turned with a soft, precise sound, and each sound felt like a small step toward reclaiming my life. "You have every legal right," he continued, "to remove yourself as co-signer, to issue a notice of financial separation, and to create an affidavit documenting the expenses you've covered under mistaken obligation. None of this implies malice on her part. It simply protects you moving forward." Protects you. Two small words, yet they nearly unraveled me. I felt tears pushed to the surface, not from sadness, but from the unfamiliar sensation of someone advocating for me. For once, I wasn't the one holding everything together. Someone was holding something or me. "I'd like to proceed," I whispered. Thomas offered a gentle smile. "Then we will." By the time I left his office, the sky had shifted into a pale winter blue. The air was crisp, and the sidewalks shimmered with thin ribbons of melting snow. I walked slowly, absorbing the feeling of taking a step without seeking anyone's approval. That evening, I received another burst of messages from Caroline. "Mom, why were you talking to the property manager? Why didn't you tell me you went to a lawyer? What is happening?" Then, "This isn't fair. You know how much stress I'm under. Why are you choosing now to make everything harder?" Followed by the inevitable, "We need to talk. Tonight. Please." For the first time, I didn't feel controlled by her urgency. I didn't rush to calm her or fix her fear or make myself small so she could feel large enough for both of us. Instead, I waited. I cooked dinner, roasted vegetables and rice. I washed the dishes slowly, letting the warm water soothe my hands. Only when I had finished caring for myself did I finally sit down and call her. She answered instantly. "Mom," she began breathlessly, "I don't understand what's going on. Luke said you were cold to him. The leasing office said—" "Caroline," I said gently, "slow down." She stopped mid-sentence. I could almost hear her confusion. This was not the mother she was used to steering, persuading, or scolding into compliance. "You're making me sound like some sort of villain," she snapped. "I'm your daughter." "I know," I replied softly. "And I love you. But love doesn't mean I have to sacrifice my financial safety or my peace." She scoffed. "Peace? What about my peace? You dropping all this suddenly is—" "It's not sudden," I said, keeping my voice warm but firm. "It's been years in the making. I've simply reached a point where I cannot continue living this way." She went silent, a long, stretched silence that felt like years of our unspoken truth settling between us. "Are you punishing me?" she finally whispered. "No," I said, and I meant it. "This isn't punishment. It's alignment, it's clarity, and it's protection of my home, my finances, my autonomy." "But what am I supposed to do without your help?" she demanded. "You do what I've always known you can do," I said gently. "You stand on your own." Her breathing grew uneven. I could imagine her pacing, running her hand through her hair, searching for some angle, some argument that would undo my resolve. but there wasn't one. "This isn't you," she said finally, her voice breaking. You're my mom." "I am," I whispered. "And I'm still here, but I'm not here to carry everything for you anymore." When we hung up, I felt no guilt, no dread, only a deep, aching compassion. For both of us. Growth rarely feels warm in the moment. Sometimes it feels like loss. But loss can be purposeful. It can be cleansing. That night, as I prepared for bed, I opened my notebook and wrote a single sentence. "I am learning how to live without disappearing." The next morning, the attorney sent me the first draft of the removal notice and affidavit. His email was short, respectful, and clear. Seeing those documents attached, formal, precise, protective, stirred something inside me. This was happening. Not someday, not eventually. Now. Over the next few days, I heard very little from Caroline. A few brief messages, clipped and cautious, as if she didn't know who she was speaking to anymore. In truth, she didn't. She had never met this version of me. I spent those quiet days painting, attending my watercolor classes, sitting with new friends who laughed easily and drank tea from mismatched mugs. I felt life stretching toward me, offering small, gentle invitations. One evening after class, the man in suspenders, his name was Harold, I'd learned, walked me to my car. "You seem lighter this week," he noted, his tone kind, not prying. "Maybe I am," I replied. He nodded thoughtfully. "Sometimes it takes a long time to realize you deserve the same care you give everyone else." His words stayed with me all the way home. That night, I sat by the window, watching snow drift softly under the streetlights. My binder rested on the table nearby, full of choices I had finally claimed. I felt no fear for the first time in a long while, only calm, only readiness, only the steady, unmistakable truth. The life I was building, slowly, carefully, bravely, was finally becoming mine. The morning my new life truly began didn't arrive with fanfare. No bright sign from the heavens, no dramatic confrontation, nothing that would seem remarkable to anyone else. It arrived quietly, like most real turning points do. I was standing at my kitchen window, watching the last of the winter frost melt into thin silver veins along the grass. The kettle clicked off behind me, filling the small room with its soft hiss of steam. Everything felt still, peaceful, almost suspended. I reached for my mug and wrapped both hands around it, letting the warmth pulse gently into my palms. For the first time in years, the day ahead belonged entirely to me. That simple truth carried a sweetness I couldn't quite name. After breakfast, I sat at the table and opened the binder, my binder, one last time. Inside were the documents Thomas had finalized: the affidavit, the removal forms, the notarized statements outlining clear boundaries of financial separation. Everything was tidy, clear, respectful, protective. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't even about correcting the past. It was simply setting a boundary so firm and so overdue that it felt like exhaling after holding my breath for a decade. Around 10 o'clock, I received a call from Thomas. His voice was warm, reassuring. "Everything is filed, Mrs. Whitmore. You're officially removed as co-signer. The affidavit is on record. Your liabilities are cleared." Cleared, a word that sounded like snow lifting from a roof all at once. "Thank you," I whispered, closing my eyes. "For all of it." "You did the hard part," he said. "Most people don't find the courage to protect themselves. You did." I hung up and let the silence settle. My breath shook, not from fear, but from a release so profound it seemed to vibrate through my bones. Then the phone rang again. Caroline. I stared at the screen for a long moment before answering. I wasn't afraid, but I needed a breath, just one, to remember that I no longer had to shrink for her comfort. "Mom," she said, her voice tight, anxious, almost cracking. "I got an email from the leasing office. They said you formally removed yourself. Why would you do that without telling me?" Her words came fast, tangled with bewilderment, but beneath them I heard something else. Fear, not of losing me, but of losing the safety net she had taken for granted. "Because," I said softly, "it was time." "That's not an explanation," she snapped. "You blindsided me. You're leaving me responsible for everything." I closed my eyes for a moment, breathing in slowly, letting my voice find its steadiness again. "Caroline, I was always responsible for everything. You just didn't have to see it." Silence, a long, trembling silence. "That's not fair," she finally whispered. "No," I said gently. "What wasn't fair was the weight I carried alone. This is balance, not punishment. I'm struggling right now, Mom. You know that. And you will get through it," I replied. "You're capable, more capable than you allow yourself to be." Her breath hitched again. "So, that's it? You're cutting me off?" "No," I said softly. "I'm letting you stand." She didn't know how to answer that. I could sense her sifting through emotions: anger, confusion, denial, maybe even understanding, but unable to settle on any one of them long enough to speak. "I have to go," she said at last, her voice small. "I need time to think." "I understand," I replied. "Take all the time you need." The call ended without resolution, but I didn't need one anymore. Closure doesn't always look like harmony. Sometimes it looks like silence, the kind that makes space for truth. I sat quietly for a while, letting my heart adjust to its new rhythm. Later that afternoon, I went to my watercolor class. The studio smelled faintly of lavender soap and wet paper. People chatted softly while arranging their brushes and palettes, but everything felt gentler somehow, as if the room sensed the shift inside me. Harold waved me over to our usual table. "You look lighter today," he said, adjusting his suspenders with a shy smile. "I feel lighter," I replied. As the class began, I let my brush glide across the paper in soft, sweeping strokes. Color blossomed beneath my hand: warm ochres, pale blues, a soft, blooming violet that reminded me of spring flowers pushing through cold earth. My breath moved in slow, steady rhythms to match each line. It struck me then how different my life had become. Not louder, not fuller, just more intentional. And in that intention lived a quiet joy I had never allowed myself before. After class, Harold asked if I wanted to join the group that met for coffee on Fridays. A few weeks ago, I would have found a polite excuse. Not because I didn't want to go, but because I didn't believe I belonged anywhere outside of someone else's needs. But now, "I'd love to," I said, surprising even myself. When I walked to my car afterward, the sun was setting, soft amber light catching on the thin patches of snow, turning the whole parking lot into a field of tiny gold mirrors. It felt cinematic in the gentlest way, as if life were offering me a quiet applause for choosing myself. Back home, I changed into soft slippers and warmed a bowl of leftover soup. The house felt warm tonight, not just from the heat, but from something deeper, an atmosphere of calm I had created with my choices. I sat in my favorite chair by the window, sipping slowly. Outside, the streetlights flickered on one by one, casting long shadows across the quiet road. A few children laughed somewhere in the distance. A dog barked twice. The world moved gently, without urgency. And I realized something. My story was no longer about retracing old wounds or proving my worth to anyone. It was about building a life where I could breathe freely, where my presence wasn't conditional or invisible, where I was allowed to expand rather than shrink, a life that belonged wholly, beautifully, finally, to me. I whispered into the stillness. I made it, Daniel. I really made it. And for a moment, I felt him there, not as a memory, but as a quiet approval settling softly around my shoulders. As the room dimmed into evening, a thought rose within me. Gentle, steady, full of truth. Sometimes the greatest act of love is simply choosing not to lose yourself. Thank you for walking beside me through this story. If it touched you in any way, I'd be grateful if you liked and subscribed. Your support helps these stories continue. And I would truly love to hear your thoughts. If you were in my place, what would you have done?